Hi, everyone. Welcome to our very first Women in Cachexia initiative. We're just going to give everybody just one more minute, and then we will get started. Alrighty, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So I just wanted to welcome everyone to our very first Women in Cachexia initiative. Dr. Brenda Martinez is going to be our very first speaker. She is a mentorship specialist and assistant professor in the Office of Educational Improvement and Innovation at OHSU. She received a Master of Arts in English from Lehigh University in 2017 and her PhD in English from the University of Texas at Austin in 2022. She came to OHSU in 2022 and currently leads the OHSU Mentorship Academy. She facilitates new faculty peer coaching circles and consults on programmatic mentoring needs. As part of the mentorship and career design team, she advocates for a proactive approach to career development, encouraging individuals to pursue meaningful career goals and curiosities throughout mentorship and immersive experiences to construct work, life, and well-being. We are all very excited to have Dr. Martinez present at our very first Women in Cachexia seminar, and the title of her talk is The Art and Science of the Diversity Statement. Please, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat, and we will either unmute you or read your question aloud. And with that, Brenda, do you want to take it over?
Yes, thank you, Brittany, for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm going to be sharing screen, so I have asked the leadership committee to help me with questions and raising hands if any questions come along. But as noted, I have my training in English literature, specifically critical race theory. And so I was really excited to be invited to talk about the DEI statement today with all of you. And I wanted to start with this quote from Angela Davis. So in this quote, she talks about having a hard time accepting diversity as a synonym for justice, because it is a corporate strategy designed to ensure that institutions function the way they were meant to function. So diversity being a word that is about difference without making a difference. And so I want to start the presentation here today because as I'll get into my talk, you'll learn that the DEI statement is fairly new and a lot of institutions require it, but don't really leverage it in an actual meaningful way. And so really the power in the diversity statement lies in you as authors who can actually take that tool to reflect on your commitment to DEIA and to really think about how you would want to move towards DEIA at any future institution or the one that you're currently in. So I did want to start with this quote because I do agree with Angela Davis in terms of the term can be empty, but it's up to us to put meaning into it. And so today I'm going to be presenting on the art and science of a diversity statement. So the 1 to 2 page statement that many of you may come across through fellowships, or maybe if you're on the academic job market. So my goal for you is that you, by the end of the session, you will understand what the statements are and are not. You will be able to describe important components of the diversity statement and have an opportunity to reflect on your identity and experiences. And so I've divided everything into really 4 parts. So we're going to talk about the diversity statement as a whole and some recommendations, what to include in the intro paragraph specifically, what to include in the body paragraphs, and then you'll all walk away with a resource that I've helped develop at UT Austin so that you can continue working on that as you try to write your own diversity statements. And I should note that as an English professor, I've also had a lot of experience helping folks improve and revise the diversity statement. So a lot of this is coming from that experience as well as research in the field. And there's references at the end of the slide. So what is a diversity statement? Oftentimes it is described as a contributions to diversity or an equity inclusivity statement. Different institutions call it DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, or DEIA, anti-racism, which is the term I use since that is what we are committed to at OHSU. But you will see a lot of different names for basically what is known as the diversity statement. And it's meant to describe how you will contribute to advancing diversity and related concerns through either your research, teaching, and or service. And the purpose of the statement from the committee standpoint is to identify candidates who have professional skills, experience, or just the overall willingness to engage in activities that would enhance campus diversity and equity efforts. So it is about organizational efforts and not necessarily just individual goals. So that is something to keep in mind. Some recommendations to consider is to be mindful of your audience. As I mentioned in the beginning, committees still don't know how to read these documents. Unlike the research statement or the teaching philosophy statement, this is a fairly new document, and every institution will either provide a prompt that is very specific or just ask for a diversity statement without any prompt. So committees are still figuring out what to do. And in our current landscape, some institutions are doing without diversity statements. So it is going to differ depending on institution and state and the politics. So always be mindful of your audience. Something else to consider is don't make it overly academic. So it's not necessarily a research paper. Don't make it overly aspirational, dense, traumatic, or well-felt. And we'll get into some details later on. It's really about highlighting your agency and asset orientations to the work of serving others and serving communities. So again, emphasis on how you will contribute to that future institution and engage with the organization as a whole. That could be an individual classroom. It could also be research work or service work in terms of the community that the institution is in. And it is an opportunity to self-reflect. Diversity statements should be 1 to 2 pages or less. I know some institutions have asked for a diversity paragraph. So again, really read the requirements and tailor it to that audience. What the diversity statement is not, it's not focused on teaching and classroom experiences. That is something you would hopefully highlight in a teaching statement. And it's not just mere descriptions of observed differences across individuals and groups. So not necessarily detailing what diversity means, and it's not a story of your own difference. So I have seen that common mistake a lot, where folks tend to use a diversity statement as they would a personal statement that we all use to get into an undergraduate college. So that is not what a diversity statement is. Unless you can talk about your personal experiences if it's tied to your teaching, research, and service using very concrete examples. So for example, someone comes into my office, their first draft of the diversity statement has a sentence like this: I appreciate students of all backgrounds. So very broad, very vague, aspirational, not concrete. It's not necessarily tied to mentorship, research, teaching. It's just a broad, empty statement. Instead, diversity statements should include sentences like the following: since students have a variety of learning preferences, I use a mix of classroom activities and assignments like, and then they will go on to concrete details about what they use within the classroom. And so in this personal statement, the author chose to write about their keen focus on accessibility and inclusivity in the teaching environment. So again, you have to drill down on the specifics. So again, it's not a personal story as in I grew up in a homogeneous neighborhood, so I am not experienced with diversity. Instead, it's more of a positionality statement. Because I had little experience with cultures outside of my own, I seek opportunities to learn from others with different perspectives on a variety of topics. And so this would be a topic sentence. They, of course, would have to go into greater detail. So again, a diversity statement also is not a document where you're being asked to prove that you have been incredibly involved in diversity efforts. It is a reflective piece. So it could also be a positionality statement where we reflect on past experiences and why it influences how we desire to be more inclusive, or we're trying to create a diverse environment. So not personal story, but positionality statement. So again, not a personal story like I am from an underrepresented group, so I understand the need for diversity. Instead, a positionality statement that reads, my experience as a member from an underrepresented group has helped me build a toolkit for mentoring students who face similar challenges based on their identity. So there is a switch from either I have not experienced diversity growing up, and I am diverse, so therefore I know there's a switch here in the positionality statements. And so this is something that we are looking for when we're reading diversity statements and wanting to look at candidates who understand that they can fill a need for this current community. So those are examples of sentences because I did want to kind of decipher what we're looking for, but I want to get into the broader aspects of what to include in the diversity statement. So we're going to talk about the intro paragraph, which should be a statement of your philosophy towards diversity. And in that, we want to make sure that you define what this approach is and what diversity means to you. So I have seen a lot of statements where folks talk about how important diversity is, but they never define it. And so we want to make sure, what do you mean by diversity or equity or inclusion? Statements that try to argue that they are committed to all three and work towards all three, very aspirational, because each one requires a lot of work and a lot of intention. So it's okay if you just want to write about how you are committed towards equity and talking specifically about how you go and do that, or inclusivity or diversity or anti-racism, what have you. But you need to be able to define what that term means to you and what your philosophy is. In the intro paragraph, it's also an opportunity to offer a positionality statement, like the example I just read before, where the candidate talks about being from an underrepresented group and therefore informing how they built an entire toolkit to help others who are underrepresented in the field. So these are options. The positionality statement is an option. It's not a requirement, but it is a very powerful tool if you are comfortable enough to use it in a diversity statement. The body paragraphs are will you show how you do it, right? So provide descriptive examples showing how you actually do diversity. So if someone writes a personal diversity statement that talks about how they're committed to inclusivity in their STEM classrooms, for example, the body paragraph has to be very detailed in terms of how did you create the lesson plan? What assignments do you use? How do you leverage student office hours? So really wanting to know how you actually put it into action instead of just listing more ways of how you're inclusive, how you're an inclusive educator. So it's very important to just be specific and drill into your examples versus packing it in with many different examples. That's what we don't want to do. And some specific questions to consider is, how do you work with specific populations and diverse backgrounds? How do you decenter whiteness in your teaching? And how will you center diversity across teaching and service? So the second question I put because, for example, in my diversity statement, when I was applying for English literature positions, I noted that in English literature, we often read canonical texts that are often white men, and we don't really read Black authors like Toni Morrison or Zora Neale Hurston. And so in my statement, I was very specific about how I decentered the canon and diversified the curriculum to allow students to get more breadth of the literature that I was teaching. So it wasn't necessarily about the students, it was really specifically about the authors and curriculum. So you have to pick your example and see how you can unfold them. So what to include intro paragraphs. So again, I cannot stress this enough. You want to define your terms. if you do mention any of these terms. And you want to personalize this document by naming your salient identities and, in a way, introducing yourself. So what do I mean by salient social identities? It means really positionality. So consider naming yourself in terms of maybe your race or gender, sexual orientation, social class, ability, and so on. It is an option, it's not required. But in naming your salient identities, adding to that. So how do you identify with and how significant is each identity to how you mentor, teach, maybe do research, or the service that you're committed to. So it's not just about naming our social salient identities, but it is about informing the work that you do. And that's what makes the difference between a diversity statement versus a personal statement. And maybe you're not comfortable naming salient identities. That's totally okay. You can also introduce yourself with the second question. So what type of training and experience do you have? How have they shaped you in professional? And how might they impact how students relate to you and your mentoring teaching style? So maybe we don't want to talk about our social identities, but perhaps we attended a rural university that had a lot of first gen students. And therefore, if you're applying to a Research One university, you can talk about how that experience, that educational background has informed how you mentor and teach moving forward. So you can also think about that training or experience. Maybe you've had two really powerful mentors who have really provided you with a toolbox that you think is incredibly inclusive and that you want to bring into your own future profession. And then the third question is, where do you know from? So how was your discipline developed? What time did your discipline play in reifying dominant ideologies or worldviews? What role did you play in the work? And what ways do you challenge or divest from some of these practices? Why or why not? So the question, where do I know from, is really trying to get at the root of whatever field you're in. So again, using my example, when I was thinking about English literature, I was thinking about how I was trained, the authors that I was exposed to in terms of how my discipline was reifying dominant authors and excluding these other prominent authors in other fields, and how I was trying to divest from that. So this is another question that can create that distance if you do not want to introduce yourself with your own social and salient identities. So there's three ways that you can really introduce yourself and craft a powerful positionality statement for your intro paragraph. I wanted to include an example so that we can see what it would look like. And I tried to anonymize it. So the first, or the only example for this introductory paragraph comes from a Latino candidate. So as a Latino immigrant who lived in XY and the United States, I am sensitive to the challenges that ethnic minorities face in academia. Thus, over the last years, I have become determined to act towards creating an environment that is more inviting towards underrepresented minorities, women, and socioeconomically underprivileged students, which I expand as a professor. As a graduate in X, I laid the groundwork for a scholarship program to bring Latino physics students to X. The program's first supported student has recently obtained his master's degree from the University of N. Others are applying. So in this example, the candidate did use their salient identity, some of the background in terms of how they grew up and why it informed how they want to support other minorities in academia, and then talks about specifically a scholarship program that they helped develop, and then mentions this student who's successfully applying for their master's as well as others who are applying. So it very quickly, the self-introduction was very much in that first sentence, and then it becomes about how they're contributing to this other community. So again, the focus shifted from self to organization very, very quickly, and that's something that I wanted to emphasize. What to include in the body paragraphs. So in the body paragraphs, you want to consider the institution. So wherever you are submitting your diversity statement. So there's three broad questions. What are the institution's stated values regarding diversity? So is diversity explicitly noted in their missions or value statement? If so, you want to read that and maybe incorporate that into your statement. Whom does the institution serve and what is indicated about the climate? So maybe doing extra research in terms of the demographic of the student body. What are the neighboring communities like relative to the institution? So as Brittany mentioned earlier, I attended Lehigh University. And so when I was looking at the demographics, I noted that the majority of the Allentown students who were born and raised there were not getting admitted into Lehigh University, which is in Bethlehem, like right in the middle of their community. And so when thinking about a diversity statement, if I were applying to a job there, I would think about how I would love to support any pipeline mentorship programs that allowed those students to get a college experience at Lehigh. So I would have to think about something specific if I'm going to incorporate the neighboring communities. And again, the third question, what kind of activities does institution carry out already? So doing some research in terms of what exists out there and maybe what you would be interested in tapping into. So an example body paragraph for this section is different from the intro. So it's not connected to the intro body paragraph example. As a faculty member, I would build on my previous experiences to take an active leadership role in fostering diversity at UCSD. The Society for Women in Graduate Studies in Chemistry and Biochem has many goals that promote a diverse environment, such as increasing the awareness about gender bias in STEM fields and encouraging the next generation of female scientists through outreach activities. They also provide resources, including professional development seminars and workshops to female scientists. Some possible ways I could contribute to the goals include participating in career seminars, working with students to develop and implement outreach activities related to inorganic chemistry and or nanoscience, and to help female graduate students and postdocs find resources that will aid in their success. So in this example body paragraph, the candidate clearly did some research about a very specific group they would be excited to join, and then talks about all these different ways that they could contribute if they were accepted and were able to join this community at UCSD. So again, the emphasis is on what you will be able to contribute and the agency you have as a candidate to promote any DEIA efforts. And so with that, I wanted to make sure I left enough time for you all to do a DEI self-assessment because it is hard to kind of receive a fire hose of information and to have all these examples, reminders, recommendations. It's still a lot to hold because it is a new document. So I wanted to make sure that all of you had an opportunity to get specific about one particular category that you could write in your own DEI statement. So when I was at UT Austin as a graduate student, I worked with their teaching and learning center, and a few of us graduate students who were from underrepresented groups felt very similar to the Angela Davis quote that it was an empty statement. A lot of universities requested them. There was not any training for how to write them. People really couldn't support with feedback. And a lot of us were trained in different critical race theory, ethnic studies field, English literature, coming from diverse fields and backgrounds. And we decided to help create a DEIA statement rubric that would allow other graduate students, postdocs to have a resource guide that basically function as a consultant. So before drafting anything, really letting people pause, take some time to reflect on their own past commitments and figure out where they would want to drill in and specify. So the DEI statement rubric has 8 categories listed here. So there's a category focused on DEIA broadly in higher education. There's a category that's very research focused. There's another that's about research practices. So not just about like the content of your research, but how you go about attaining and developing your research, which are 2 different things that we want to focus on. Then there's a section on teaching and mentorship, another on collaboration and leadership, because we do understand that in some fields, DEIA may not be very pertinent in the content, but a lot of students and postdocs have wealth of leadership experiences leading diversity initiatives. So making sure you reflect on that. And then, of course, service, engagement, and outreach. So sometimes it's not connected to your current institution or your job. It's just about the commitment you've made in your personal life. And so we try to be succinct as possible and created these 6 categories. And in a diversity statement, committees do not want to read 2 pages where you just list how you do diversity in each category. Committees really want to see you spend your time and reflect deeply on something specific. So our recommendation is for a first draft, selecting one of these categories, reflecting on that, and then trying to draft into that specific example. So in the self-assessment, in the very first page, and you'll get a link to that soon, you will select one of the categories again, and then you're just going to annotate the rubric to see how you've demonstrated your commitment in any of the following ways. So ideally, this is an in-person workshop. So we bring out printed papers, and I ask folks to put a check mark to anything that they feel definitely demonstrates their commitment to DEIA. A squiggly line if you feel like you demonstrate some commitment in this area, and then an asterisk if you would like to demonstrate your commitment in that area, but probably need more information, support, and/or resources. And since you're all online, maybe highlighting using different color highlighters or just using different letters and markers in your own Google Doc. And so if you scan this code, it should be able to take you to a public access Google Doc that has the entire rubric. I believe it's more than 4 pages long. So again, I want to give you some time to just skim through it and then pick one category to annotate it with. And so that is a resource that you can download on your own desktop and keep and use to draft responses into these boxes before you try to draft an entire narrative, because it is harder to free write into an entire page versus just focusing on a section. So it's meant to help with the writing process as well. If the scan doesn't work, you can use a tiny URL at the bottom. So it's tinyurl.com/art of DEIA, all capital, and it should take you to the Google document. So I'm going to start the timer. I do want you all to have 5 minutes to read the rubric, choose the category, and annotate it. And then we can start the Q&A. So I will start my timer now. And I'm going to stop sharing screen so that I can share the rubric. Share. Perfect. So I see a few of you have accessed it. Again, please download it so that way you're not annotating this public one that other people will be downloading. Download that document for your own files. The instructions will be here on the first page, and then all the categories are divided. And there's very specific questions too that will guide your reflection. And then Paige and Brittany, I will be able to start Q&A after the 5 minutes are up.
Sounds great. Thank you, Brenda.
We have a question in the chat. Somebody says, so we just pick one area, correct, for now?
Yes, for now. And then you can pick, if you were to write a full DIA, my recommendation would be pick 2 to 3 that you would actually want to write into your statement. but for this reflective exercise, just one. Three more minutes left. Forty seconds left for anyone who's still annotating. I don't know if you can all hear that, but that's the alarm. Like, so the last thing I wanted to share was the references, which again I can send via the committee. But really just a reminder, as I said in the beginning of the talk, that these statements, you might see them come up, people will request them, and maybe after you've received the fellowship or the position, no one will ask it again, but it's really up to us to use it as a tool that really showcases our commitment. So you can take one philosophy statement, like 2 to 3 sentences from your statement or a short paragraph, and maybe add it to your website, to your syllabi, maybe share with mentees when you meet with them. You can really use this tool to really honor your values and how you want to move as an educator professional. So you can add meaning to the statement, even if it feels like it's just a requirement at the time. So I will stop sharing screen. And if there are any questions, we'll love to take the next 10 minutes to answer them.
We have a raised hand by Vera Mabsurak. So I'm going to ask to unmute. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So when we're teaching at a university, so I did the teaching.
Okay.
So, I have a class of 150 students, and one of the questions is, do I offer students flexibility regarding assessment methods or create different opportunities for students to demonstrate what they've learned? So in that scenario, like I did most of the check marks, like I'm doing okay, but I would look for ways to, like, how do I allow those opportunities when, like, it's an assignment, it's an exam, it's an assignment, it's a class discussion. I don't know how many options I can give. I mean, I'd probably have 150 different things to mark. So I'm just not sure if that's always relevant or how we, like, I was thinking maybe on an exam, you could give answer A or B
Mhm.
for the same
Well,
number of marks or something like that. But I'd like your insight into that.
yeah, well, really great question, because that allows me to emphasize something about the rubric. So as you noted, even in the teaching section, there's a lot of questions. And so really happy to hear that you have check marks for most. But in the DEIA statement, I would, as a consultant, ask you to use a rubric to reflect on it, put question marks, and then I would have a conversation with you about which of these check marks do you feel most strongly about, that you would be excited to write about and include as an example. So if assessment is one of the tricky ones that's giving you pause, this is a good moment to reflect and say, do I even have the flexibility to do something like that? And if not, that's really more reflection of the structure and the institution in the classroom, less
Yes.
about what you can do as an educator. And even that in itself could be a reflection in a DEI statement, how like
Okay.
your desire to be an inclusive educator would probably inspire you to have like smaller groups, and create like small group discussions, but that's not feasible in the structure. Something like that can exist in the DI statement.
Okay.
So it'll be up to you as an author to say, do I want to reflect on that and write about that if I'm applying to a small liberal arts that actually allows a seminar style so they can see my value? Or if I'm applying to a UC, with big 100 student classrooms, do I maybe want to pick one of my strongest check marks and really emphasize how I practice DEIA in teaching? So
Okay.
it's not necessarily like, oh, great, you put all your check marks there, so now I want you to write a statement that talks about each one. No, at the second process is to pick
Sort of highlighting. Okay.
strongest. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, really love your question. Thank you for asking that.
Hi, Brenda. I always appreciate your talks and love them. I have a question. I have two questions. So Paige or Nisha, stop me if someone else has questions, if mine go on. But my first question is, so if I choose to write about inclusivity, I don't want to negate that I still appreciate and understand the rest of the DEIA.
Mhm.
And while if you go through all of them, you're going to have a 10-page document.
Yes.
But if I highlight one, so say inclusivity, is it appropriate to maybe spend 2 or 3 lines saying how much like you still value the other components, or?
Yes, you can definitely, if that's causing concern and pause, I would definitely say keep it at like 2 lines to explain how you understand the other components, how you value it, but why in this statement you're going to focus on inclusivity, because that itself will take up a page or 2 depending on how many examples and how robust. So I do think that would be like in your intro paragraph, and then emphasizing how for the rest of the statement you're really going to focus on inclusivity, and they don't exist separately, right?
Right.
So like you can write and frame that to say like, we understand how D leads to I and the goal is E and ultimately A or B. So like that's really what a DEI statement should say. The committee's requesting this depending on who's in the committee. Some of them will understand that and others might need you to spell it out. So you could frame that in the introduction.
Okay. And then my second question was, so most universities now have a statement posted, some departments do.
Mhm.
Is it appropriate if you if you think their statement is lacking, to say how you would make it better in a pleasant way? Or
really good question. So it is appropriate to cite the statement. I think the second body paragraph, for example, that candidate really did research on one very specific organization and in a way paraphrased what the organization says it's committed to. And then they went on to talk about how they will contribute that by joining very specific activities. So in a very similar way, you can paraphrase the statement of the institution. And it's really going to be about the tact and transition and saying, and I'm personally committed to seeing X out. And so, for example, at OHSU, I did read the statement that we are committed to anti-racism. And so in my interview, I talked about how specifically through Mentorship Academy, I want to revise the curriculum so that it's more explicit how mentors should be committed to anti-racism. I did not say, I don't think you are actually committed to anti-racism, but I did say, hey, I see a gap. And I think I can fill that need to help the organization meet the goals it says it wants to meet. So that's really, it's about the gap, and that's going to be in the drafting stage. So maybe in the first stage, you are more than welcome to write exactly how you want to say it. And then you want some peer review feedback so that we can help you massage that out in transition.
thank you very much.
Yeah, great question.
I have a question. So when you're applying for like a job or something, you're talking about like this long statement, but I've also written grants where, I mean, first of all, there's just not space for anything in a grant, but like trying to condense it down into like really like a very small paragraph, like maybe 3 or 4 sentences. And like, do you have suggestions about how you can do that and make it meaningful and not just like sort of a vague, broad statement that doesn't really have any impact?
Really good question. So yes, and unfortunately the answer isn't the easiest way. So the reason I do recommend this rubric and reflecting on that, writing in some answers here before you try to create a paragraph or maybe a page of a statement, that's still the step into, okay, I've reflected on this rubric. I know which category, and from this category, which specific bullet points I'm going to write into. Now I'm writing my paragraph or 1 page or 2 page. From there, now I can select what are the 1 or 2 sentences that I think really capture my philosophy. And so in those shorter statements, it's really about featuring your philosophy. It's not going to be about how you do it necessarily. It's not going to be a specific example. It's just going to be your philosophy. And so this is why I say like it's great to have the full statement, whether it's a paragraph or a page or 2, because if a student or mentor reads your philosophy and then you get accepted, you can always share the rest of your statement to show like this is not an empty philosophy. This is how I'm committed to carrying it out. And I would love your support, or for your mentees, I would love for you to hold me accountable. So in those instances, I say including your philosophy. And it's really the structure limiting you. So that's not on you, but you're going to get creative on how to incorporate that. Great question.
Do we have any last minute questions? No? All right. Then thank you, Brenda, for coming today. And this was an amazing talk. And I think if it's fine with you, we will like upload this video on our WCX website, the recording. And thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you all, and thank you for the questions.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Brenda.
Brenda.
Lots of thank yous coming through in the chat. So
Yeah.
I think that's it's a lot of information for all of us to think over in the coming days.
Good. Yeah. Hopefully the rubric helps kind of ease it in.
Definitely.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, bye.